We found that because of the huge amount of variation, it would be very expensive to monitor for pesticides in these crops in the way that a lot of people are proposing to do. So, for example, if you wanted to understand the difference between meadow foam fields, you would need about 7,000 fields to sample, and that would cost you $3.35 million to sample. So that would just
Okay.
be a huge investment of time and resources in order to detect a difference of the hazard quotient value of 154.
From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Are bees at more hazard to pesticides than they were, say, 5 years ago? It's a hard thing to measure. There are so many small pesticide applications that take place in a working landscape, some of them having very little impact on bees, and others at other times having drastic effects, outright killing the bees. Now, there are all sorts of systems for monitoring for pesticide contamination after pesticides have been applied. Think, for example, of routine water quality testing that can help pinpoint whether the education and regulatory programs we have in place are doing a good enough job to minimize the environmental impacts of pesticide use to aquatic systems. My next guest has been thinking and working on this problem at OSU for her PhD program for bees. Dr. Emily Carlson has graduated with her PhD from the Department of Horticulture, and she has a new paper coming out in the journal PLOS ONE titled The Power to Detect Change. Can honeybee pollen be used to monitor for pesticide residue in the landscape? In this interview, we get a sneak peek at the paper, and we learn about whether we can use monitoring of incoming pollen to colonies to detect positive or negative change to pesticides. This week on Pollination. Hi, Emily. Welcome to Pollination.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
I think this is a great conversation because in some ways, listeners may not realize this, but you were my first PhD student that we co-supervised with Ramesh Sagili, and we would have, very regular conversations. So this is kind of like peering into.
Yeah, definitely.
But now you're Dr. Carlson, you're fully graduated, and I thought it was a good opportunity, especially since you have a new paper that's coming out in the journal PLOS ONE, to pick up on some of the work that you've done under your PhD thesis. And I guess most people probably know that pesticides are evaluated for safety against bees, that there are these extensive laboratory tests that are submitted to EPA when a new pesticide is registered or when it's being re-reviewed, and may include things like small field studies to ensure that if the pesticide is used under conditions that are outlined on the label, the product would be safe to bees. But as I guess listeners probably also know, and here in Oregon for sure, that there are things like water quality testing where even after registration, we're still monitoring to make sure that the registration process is working. And I guess this is really the kind of the focus of the paper that's coming out for you, and it's real innovative work. I guess to set it up, what is the challenge for doing something like water quality testing, post-registration water quality testing, but for bees?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question because, obviously we want to make sure that we know our registration process is working. And so having a post monitoring system would be beneficial for a lot of states that are interested in either assessing pesticide hazard or looking at, whether or not certain practices are working for them. And currently, we have, a way to report bee kills. And so that is the main way that we get feedback on what pesticides are doing in the environment for bees, is you can report these bee kills. But we know also that most bees are not exposed in this kind of like dramatic way. And instead, pesticides are found in pretty much every bee matrix. So they're found in honey, in wax, in the bee bodies themselves, in pollen. And so, one question that we had was kind of, could we monitor for changes in pesticide over time, looking at these more everyday exposures rather than
Right.
dramatic bee kill events? And, obviously that poses a lot of challenges because when you are wanting to monitor a specific crop for pesticides and their impact on bees, you can't tie all of the bees to little leashes
Oh,
and
right.
prevent them only going to one crop, right? They're going to sample the whole landscape.
So, like, if you
So,
had
like,
a bee colony in a blueberry field, they may not stay on the blueberries, but may go to the adjacent crimson clover field or something. They're not it's not I guess that's the way a beekeeper thinks about it. I'm on this field, and any pesticide exposure is coming from the field my colonies are physically on, but that's not necessarily the case.
yeah, exactly. And even things like field margins, or where you have like little blooming crops or little blooming weeds around the edges of your crop fields, those could be places where bees are
Mm.
foraging.
Uh-huh.
And so, on one hand, right, that might be a benefit. You might say, hey, we're sampling this whole landscape, we're getting an idea of what's going on. But on the other hand, that might be a big challenge because how are you supposed to know if the changes you're making on a specific crop are actually working for that specific pesticide exposure coming off the crop?
So is that kind of like the key challenge, or are there other challenges?
That's definitely a big challenge. But another issue with understanding pesticide exposure to bees and kind of monitoring for it is when you test bee matrices for pesticide residues, you're most likely going to end up with a laundry list of different pesticides that are detected. So, a little preview of coming events. We had some samples that had up to 12 different pesticides in them.
Oh,
And
okay.
so that leads to an issue where you have to ask yourself, how am I going to take all of these little pesticide detections and turn them into a single number that I can use to determine if it's changing over time? So, the dual issue of bees are foraging around the environment, they're not just going onto the crop, and then also they're picking up a diversity of pesticides, which in and of themselves, like, you have to decide how you're going to summarize that basically.
And I suppose part of it is, let's say like pollen. I know you've talked a lot. You and I have talked a lot about many people use pollen because you can trap the pollen as it comes into the colony. But I guess if you take all of this pollen that comes from all these different fields and it goes into one little bin, it's hard to know. One detection. It might not be. It might be just a little bit, and some of it may be. Different pollen sources might be. Kind of washing things out, so to speak. That there's a kind of problem with these aggregate numbers. They may not take into account the full exposure that the colony is getting.
Yeah, that's a really good point because you can also take those two individual problems and they create in and of themselves a third problem, which is that different types of pollen are going to have different types of pesticides on them. And you have to kind of choose if you're going to aggregate all of that together or separate it out. And so, yeah, so monitoring for pollen and pesticides for pesticides and pollen is much less straightforward than you might think
Okay.
and poses a big challenge.
All right. So tell us a little bit about how you, in the paper, how you were able to sort of pose the question of whether something like post-registration monitoring for what bees are being exposed to in the landscape is feasible.
Yeah, so this work was done as part of my dissertation for my PhD. And so we wanted to look at a variety of crops that were pollinated by honeybees and determine, what pesticides they might be exposed to and also what the source of that pesticide exposure was. So whether or not it was coming from on the crop or off the crop.
Okay.
So in order to do that, we went out and trapped across 70 different sites over 2 years in 4 different crops. And we chose our 4 different crops pretty carefully. So we had cherry, which is occurs bloom usually in April, and that has a lot of natural habitat and nearby in the areas where we were monitoring. We looked at meadowfoam, which is a highly attractive native plant that's also grown for oil and seed production. And then we looked at clover, which is a another highly attractive crop that has like an emerging pest problem. So we
Hmm.
suspected maybe we might see some pesticides on that. And then we had our carrot seed, which is a not very attractive crop to bees, but requires
Oh,
bee pollination in order to seed set.
and those are kind of the when I think about when I talk to Oregon beekeepers, those are some of the bigger pollinations that they have to do in the state. Okay. All right. So, and you said 70 sites. So I imagine what I'm picturing is like 70, which seems like a lot of fields, and then there's honeybee colonies that are sort of placed adjacent to it, and you would just sample the pollen that was coming into the colony in the same way, I guess, a water quality tester would like, dip a ladle. Presumably somebody could go out and do something like this, a state agency, for example, and get a sense of, what's the status of, are the colonies getting exposed to more pesticides or less pesticides over time?
Yeah, exactly. And we did this over, like I said, over 2 years.
Okay.
So we were also kind of looking at whether or not time was an important factor in changing pesticide residues. And so the way we collected our pollen was actually super fun. We did pollen traps, which your listeners might be familiar with. So they're these front porch kind of looking devices that you attach to the front of the colony, and when the foragers are returning home with pollen on their legs, the like mesh forces them to drop their pollen load. It kind of like pops it off into a basket below the site or
Oh,
below the colony. And
okay.
so the end result is that you can engage the pollen traps for 24 to 48 hours, and you end up with a basket full of pollen where each little pollen bundle is representing one honeybee leg's worth of pollen trip.
Okay. No, that's really great. And I remember, my understanding of bee biology, honeybee biology, they show fidelity on their trip. So oftentimes those loads are from one single, they don't mix pollen together. It's like one, if they were on dandelions, and you'd get this little sampling of these two little loads coming off her back legs of dandelion pollen, these little pellets.
Yes, and that was definitely something that we were relying on. And we had pretty good success with it in the sense that there were not many mixed pollen loads that we encountered,
Okay.
which kind of like moves into the second part. So, okay, so we go out, we do all this trapping, we're trying to get different crops, we're trying to get crops that are at different points in their bloom period. And then we bring those pollen samples back to the lab and sort them out into their various colors.
Okay.
So, anyone who has looked at honeybee comb will know that there can be a whole rainbow of pollen that you see inside. And so, what we were doing was individually sorting out the different pollen loads. And so, then we would do two different things with those color sorted groups. The first was to perform acetolysis, which is a very strong reaction involving heat and acid, which strips the outer layer of the pollen grain, which is made of fat, so that it exposes the protein underneath. And that allows you to identify what plant it came from using a microscope.
Oh, it's good. It's
So,
good that you mentioned this as well. If people are interested, a couple weeks ago, we had a podcast with Dr. Priya Chakrabarty, and she talked about that process. And even earlier, we had a great episode with Pierre Lau, Dr. Pierre Lau at USDA. Okay, great. So that you can actually tell, you got the color pattern, but you could confirm that it's like one, genus of plant or something.
exactly. And I'm so glad you mentioned Pierre Lau because When I was starting my PhD, I definitely just called him and he explained how to do acetolysis to me. I took like a ton of notes and he was like, "Look up this paper, look up that paper." So, thank you, Pierre. So, yeah, so we did that. So we performed our acetolysis and then we took those color sorted subsamples and shipped them off to a lab to perform pesticide analysis. And so at the end of the day, what we ended up with was a pesticide residue analysis for the whole sample. So we
All the
call that
pollen.
our composite because it's the whole rainbow, whatever we
Okay,
caught that day.
got it.
And then also the pesticide residues for the individual plant genuses that
All right.
made up that pollen sample.
Okay, so you knew that it reminds me earlier in the interview when you said, "Oh, you put your colony at the side of the blueberry field and they go to the crimson clover." That was allows you to sort of see how much of the pollen came from the crop that the colonies were supposed to be, being rented for to pollinate and how much of the pollen came from something else.
Exactly.
And then you
And
knew
for
the
this
pesticide from either. You could say this much these pesticides came and this amount came from this source and the others. Okay, gotcha. Sorry to interrupt.
No, no. And so yeah, so we did that and then we also had that other problem that we talked about in the first question of like, okay, so we have all these pesticide residues. How are we going to add them up into one number that makes sense? And so what we chose to do was we used what's most common in the literature, which is called hazard quotient.
Okay.
And hazard quotient is a way of relating the pesticide detection in pollen to the LD50 or the toxicity of that pesticide. So
Okay.
essentially, what you're doing is you're creating this number, a single number, where it's scaling each pesticide detection according to the toxicity of that pesticide. And
That
then
makes
you
sense. So
add up.
you would kind of like you would say this pollen had, if you added up all the toxicities in them, you had this pesticide and it's not very toxic and this pesticide it's super toxic, but it's at low. You could just kind of like capture the kind of amount of bee toxicity in a pollen.
Exactly. That's the idea. And that's what's very commonly done. But this also kind of, opens another question, which is like you're losing a lot of information at this point, right? You're taking, like, it's good that you're able to simplify all of these detections into a single number, but you're also compromising a lot of detail by doing that. So you kind of have to, weigh both of them.
What do you mean by that? You're compromising some detail. What kind of things get lost?
Yeah. So, for example, if I have one pollen sample that has four pesticides in it and it has a hazard quotient of 100, that would be indistinguishable from a different pollen sample that has only one pesticide in it that also has a hazard quotient of 100. And
Uh,
this gets really tricky because we also know that things like the number of pesticides detected in a pollen sample are correlated with negative outcomes on bee health. So
uh,
you're kind of compromising part of you're making this trade-off, right, in order to use hazard
well, I
quotient.
can envision, and I know this is something that people know that one pesticide may be toxic on its own, but it may, in combination with another, have a different toxicity profile. And if you treat them one, you just add them up, you lose that information.
Exactly. Yeah, you're also
Interesting.
losing any information about synergy that you might be able to determine or things like that.
Okay. All right. So you've got these. You've now got. You can tell you've got these different crops, and you know how much of the pesticide from different sites. I imagine the thing is there's variation. Some sites have a lot, and some sites don't. How do you use this data to sort of test the question of the feasibility of a program like this for perhaps like a state?
Yeah, so the next thing that we did was perform a power analysis.
Mm,
So, power analysis is essentially like a rearranged t test that maybe some people are familiar with. And it's this type of statistical test that allows you to determine how many samples are needed to detect a difference between groups. So you can essentially say, okay, I ran this test and I had 10 samples. Based on the variation of these samples, I didn't find any significant difference between my groups. And a power analysis would say, okay, well, next time you do this test, you should do 50 samples. And
Uh,
that will give you
okay.
the level of resolution that you need to see if what the difference between these groups is.
That makes
Um,
sense to me. I can imagine in a situation if I went to 10 sites and they had the identical hazard quotient every time. I might not have to do 10 sites because there's so little variation between them that to detect even a small difference, I don't need that many sites. But if they're wildly different, one site's like this and one site's like that, then to detect that small difference might require, and the power analysis would tell you this. I guess it would tell you, okay, I
Yeah,
think,
it essentially looks at the amount of variation and says, how many fields do we need to sample?
okay,
And so what we found was, well, first of all, with the general data that we were looking at, we found that there was huge variation within the pesticide levels that were detected. So we found
uh,
pesticide detections that were over 10,000 hazard quotient, and then we had others that were 0. So this is a huge range.
wow, okay,
Yeah. And just for a bit of context, scientists generally say, although it is debated, about 1,000 hazard quotient would be like a concerning level. So 10,000 is quite a lot.
uh,
And so then we plug all of this information into our power analysis, and we found that because of the huge amount of variation, it would be very expensive to monitor for pesticides in these crops in the way that a lot of people are proposing to do, or that we attempted to do. So for example, if you wanted to understand the difference between meadow foam fields, you would need about 7,000 fields to sample, and that would cost you $3.35 million to sample. So that would just
okay,
be a huge investment of time and resources in order to detect a difference of the hazard quotient value of 154.
okay. Okay. All right. So that's great. So that the feasibility, it seems as though that this is not, there's so much variability when someone goes out and takes this sample, this equivalent of the water quality sample, to be able to say, like if you wanted to say like, oh, we have a target of, reducing pesticide exposure to bees, or risk or hazard to bees over the next 10 years of, a certain percentage, you you would only be able to detect very, very big differences. The kind of, give us a sense of like what we're talking about. What were you were saying 150 units at hazard quotient. What was the kind of difference that you were looking at?
Oh, yeah, excuse me, thank you. So we were looking at, let's say that a farmer or a state agency, they have a goal of reducing pesticide hazard by 5% every year.
Okay.
And this is something that we based off of historical data from our region. So let's say, okay, you want to reduce it 5% every year, and you do that for 5 years. So you'd sample in year one, and then you'd sample again in year 5 to see if your mitigation efforts made the difference that you wanted. And essentially, what this is a difference of is if in year 1 or year 0 you had a hazard quotient of 100. By the end of year 5, you would have a hazard quotient of 77. So that's a
Hmm.
5% change every year for 5 years. And so, yeah, so in order to detect that change in meadow foam, you would be looking for a difference of 154. And you would only be able to detect that change if you were willing to spend $3.35 million. Now, that was the most expensive out of all of the crops that we looked at. Not all of them were that expensive. So, for example, if you wanted to determine a difference in cherry, you would only need to spend $129,000 to detect about a hazard quotient difference of 575. And so it kind of depends on the variation within the crop of how many sites you would need.
Hmm.
Because one of the issues we ran into with meadowfoam was that a lot of them were zero. We were getting no pesticides, no pesticides, no pesticides.
Hmm.
But then every now and then you would have a huge spike in pesticide
Oh, uh-huh.
detections. And those are very difficult to capture in a predictable way. And so the number of sites you'd need to sample is reflecting that.
Interesting. Okay, so I guess what does this mean? What is when we look at your work and this forthcoming paper, is it what if post registration monitoring is maybe not feasible? Like, what is the kind of implications of your findings?
Yeah, so, I think it's important to keep in mind that, honeybees can, we're kind of using them as these ecological sensors, right? You can drop a colony anywhere you want and use it to sample the landscape. And that is very useful, and I don't want to undersell like the value of a resource like that. And investing in post-registration monitoring is a really good idea because that is a way to tell like where rubber meets the road. Are we meeting the goals that we've set for ourselves? However, using this particular method with hazard quotient might require a more nuanced interpretation
Uh,
than you kind of would first think. And so even if we're continuing to do this pesticide monitoring in pollen, perhaps thinking of other ways we could use that data. So, looking for particular chemistries over time, or looking at the way that, these floral resources are changing. Those could all be very useful things. And using hazard quotient to just determine how pesticides change over time would be a pretty expensive option to try to undertake if you want the statistical power that most people do.
Okay, so just to get that was a lot. So just to get this in perspective, it may be rather than just trying to bin everything together into this one number, it may be, oh, here's a pesticide of concern to monitor for, or like something a little bit more targeted, a little bit more tailored perhaps to each crop, rather than trying to like reduce everything down to sort of this one measure for everything.
Yeah, and I think that looking for new ways to kind of use this pesticide residue data could be really useful in the future, because certainly it is useful to have information about what pesticides are coming into the colony. But I think when we are considering the sort of compromises we make by collapsing all of that information into one number, maybe we're not willing to give up all of that information for the ease of use.
Fascinating conversation. For those who are interested, we'll update the show notes. I think your paper is probably in the process of getting typeset and ready to come out. We'll make sure that it appears
Yeah.
in the show notes. But real delight talking with you today, Dr. Carlson. And thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button, where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.